Good afternoon and welcome to Bridgecast. We're super excited that you all are with us. This week we have Dr. Paul Moriarty with us. Dr. Moriarty has been working with bridge builders now for relatively recent time, but still about 6 or 7 months now. Dr. Moriarty plans on going to the 2020 St. Louis Degree Exchange Program as our faculty advisor or our facilitator through Webster University. Dr. Moriarty and I had a chance to meet through the recommendation of Dr. Parsons, who spoke on Bridgecast a couple of weeks ago, and Dr. Moriarty has been going in headstrong into our program, wanting to learn more, and has quite a bit of experience that he can talk about today in Guatemala and Hawaii and in other human rights programs around the United States and in St. Louis in specific. Before we go into that, I want to make sure to give a quick hit to our raffle. We are going to be raffling off those earrings next week that we had from the Sioux YMCA. Again, all of those raffle ticket funds go straight to the St. Louis Degree Exchange Program. Because of our Run for Degree being canceled from COVID-19, we're trying to make up a couple of those funds to again offer our program to individuals who need it, to be a little bit more accessible for them, to allow it to have as wide a range for exchange team members as possible. So again, it should be up on our website today. We apologize that there might have not been an exact raffle picture, but we'll have that picture up today and then a spot for you to do that raffle. Other than that, I want to make sure to give a thank you to Shared Streets with Nick Reinhardt-Schwark, our chairperson of the board, who in addition to us, collaboration with us, did medic training that was centered around protesting. Last Sunday, we were able to offer that to 13 people who came completely free of charge, and we had a great discussion. We had a great training. We got hands-on training, time practicing with one another from a social distance perspective in Blackburn Park, and we look forward to doing more in the future. So thank you to all who came out, and I look forward to hopefully seeing more next time we offer that medic training. Okay, let's jump right into the conversation with Dr. Moriarty. I'm so thankful that you were able to join us, Paul. Can you give us a little bit of an intro about your work with Webster University and beyond?
Sure. Thanks. Good to see you, Jasper. I've been teaching at Webster University for about 15 years, I think. I lose track of time. Teaching both in the philosophy program and in the human rights program in the Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Webster. Before that, I had been teaching at the University in Virginia, and then before that, I was living in Hawaii for a little while, which we'll talk about later.
Yes. Thank you. I know that we originally met in the Introduction to Human Rights class, which I thought was incredibly interesting, especially with your focus on Latin American studies and politics, and going into South American studies and politics as well from a human rights perspective. I know that you worked within Rainforest Action Network and also the Rights Action within Guatemala. Can you talk to us a little bit about your time working within those two organizations?
Sure. So, let me put it this way. My grandparents moved to Hawaii when I was about 3 years old. And a few years after that, my uncle moved to Hawaii, and then eventually my mother moved out there. So I've spent a lot of time in Hawaii, and I actually lived there for about a year in 1989, 1990. Okay. And during the time that I was in Hawaii, I was part of an environmental organization. I was an activist and a volunteer with an environmental organization called the Rainforest Action Network. As environmentalists, we were, and specifically the Rainforest Action Network, we were focusing on the loss of rainforests around the world. The world's largest tropical rainforest is in the Amazon in Brazil, the Amazon has been depleted for a number of reasons over the years. So, for example, sometimes they cut down the forest and burn the land in order to grow grass so that they can graze cattle down there, essentially to produce beef to sell to for the United States. And in the rainforest, the soil is very fertile, but all of the nutrients are just really sort of in the top layer of the soil. And so when they first cut down the forest and burned everything, it's very, very nutrient rich, and there's a lot of rain, and so the grass grows very quickly, and so it's an excellent source for cattle ranchers of grass. But that top layer of soil quickly becomes depleted of nutrients, and then they have to just move on to another patch of rainforest. So they'll graze, right? It's much, much smaller. But because of Hawaii's isolation, the Hawaiian rainforest has a huge number of threatened and endangered species of plants and animals. And so our Rainforest Action Group there, we were focused on trying to protect a little bit of rainforest that's left in Hawaii. And while I was there, one of the major threats to the rainforest was a proposal to build a geothermal power plant on the Big Island of Hawaii. And the idea was to get heat from near a volcano on the Big Island, to turn a turbine to create electricity, which they would then transport to the hotels of Waikiki on the island of Oahu via an undersea cable. And so the proposal was to build this 500 megawatt power plant. The problem really for us was that the place where they wanted to build this power plant, the place where the geothermal activity was best for building this power plant, was right in one of the remaining patches of rainforest on the Big Island. And so they were planning to cut down a bunch of the rainforest in order to put in geothermal wells and roads to get to those wells and so forth. And so the Rainforest Action Group that I was a part of, the Rainforest Action Network, partnered with a Native Hawaiian group called the Pele Defense Fund. And we worked together with them. Now, for Native Hawaiians, Native Hawaiians, like a lot of First Nations people, have a very strong connection to the land. And for them, the rainforest is really a sacred place, right? It's a place where they perform religious ceremonies. It's a place where they get plants that they use for traditional medicines. And so the loss of the rainforest in Hawaii is of great significance to them. And so these two groups really work together well, the Rainforest Action Network and the Pele Defense Fund. And we organized demonstrations against this proposed geothermal power plant. It was a company called True Geothermal that was planning to build it. At one point, we had a demonstration with about 2,000 people out marching in the rainforest in a really remote area on the Big Island. We also did marches in Honolulu at the state capitol. We were on the front page of the newspaper many, many days. It really raised a lot of attention, and ultimately, we won. Ultimately, the geothermal plant was canceled. The plans for that plant were canceled. The big 500 megawatt plant was canceled. They did end up building a much smaller 50 megawatt power plant, which is just used to provide electricity for some people on the Big Island. But it's got a much, much smaller footprint than the original 500 megawatt plant would have had. So that was a huge victory for us. And later, some of the people from the Pele Defense Fund, they invited us to join them for a weekend on a small island called Kaho'olawe. This is an uninhabited island that for years was bombed by the U.S. Navy. They used it for target practice. So they were just, shelling the island for decades. But it has since been returned to the Native Hawaiians. and they control the island now. So they invited us to join them for a weekend on this uninhabited island. We were helping to put a thatched roof on a structure that they were building out there. And it was a really great time. So for me, the partnership between this sort of environmental group that was mostly, white environmentalists, sort of middle class, and then the Native Hawaiian group was really valuable. It was something, and of course, I'm not Native Hawaiian. I didn't grow up in Hawaii, right? So I don't have the same sort of connection to the land there that they do. But by working together, I felt like we were really able to do something positive there. And so for me, those sorts of partnerships, those sorts of connections, we need to look for those any place we can. And I think that's what you've really been doing with bridge builders. And so I appreciate what you're doing there as well.
Thank you. Dr. Moriarty? Yeah, sorry, you go.
So that was a bit of my experience in Hawaii. I just wanted to mention, I think that last week you were talking about decolonization and the intersection between that and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
And while I was talking about Hawaii, I wanted to mention that Hawaii has its own history of colonialism. Europeans first arrived in Hawaii in 1778, and basically what happened was that 6 missionary families divided up the islands, right? They claimed all the land for themselves. Yeah. Never mind the people who were living there at the time, right? And in the process of claiming all of the land of Hawaii for themselves, they made themselves very rich. And as you know, like colonialism, during the colonial era, the European colonial powers would go to places in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, and they would take over the government. They would take control of the land. They would control people and so-called environmental resources, natural resources, and the native and the natural environment. They would sort of use all of that essentially for their own financial benefit, economic benefit, and which I think justify it to themselves with this idea of the white man's burden, right? The idea that they're actually helping the people who they're colonizing was how I think they tried to justify it to themselves. Yeah. Right? They described the people who were colonized as savages, who they were going to help by civilizing them, teaching them to read the Christian Bible, and ultimately saving their souls, right? But really, it was a combination of military power, missionaries, cultural exploitation, environmental exploitation, for the benefit of the colonizers, right? And there was this whole sort of system of thinking that went along to justify that. Mm-hmm. And so that's certainly what happened in Hawaii, right? And today there are only about 5% of the population of Hawaii are Native Hawaiians, right? But those Native Hawaiians are still experiencing the effects of colonization. Yeah. And that's part of what sort of trying to protect this last patch of rainforest was also about trying, for them it was just a continuation of this history of colonialism.
Yes.
And I've seen other examples of colonialism and neocolonialism in my own lifetime. Yeah. So I've spent a good bit of time down in Guatemala. There's an organization who I've gone with. They actually do human rights delegation, sort of similar to what you do with bridge builders.
Okay. Yeah.
And they're called Rights Action or Derechos en Acción. they're a sort of American, U.S. and Canadian-based organization that works in Guatemala, but also partners with Guatemalan human rights organizations.
Okay.
And they're a very small organization. They've only got a few employees, but they do, I think, fantastic and important work there. And so with Rights Action, I went to see, for example, in the western part of Guatemala, near the city of San Marcos, there are mountains where where Mayan people live, right? Where the population is predominantly indigenous Mayans, and Guatemala still has a large indigenous population. Something like 60% of the country are indigenous. And so, but a lot of the Mayan people have been sort of forced up into the mountaintops in Guatemala. When the conquistadors came, right? When the Spaniards colonized, they took the good, fertile land down in the valleys and pushed the Mayan people up into the mountaintops. And so today, the Mayans are living up in the mountains in an area that's not good farmland. The soil tends to be very dry and sandy, and it's really hard to farm on the side of a mountain because it's so steep. But that's where the people are living. They tend to be very poor. But it turns out that there is, in the mountaintops in the western part of Guatemala, there is gold. And there are American and Canadian gold mining companies who are mining that gold, right? And they sort of go in and essentially blow the top off of a mountain with dynamite. They then crush up the rocks and dirt. The gold is not gold nuggets like we sort of think about people panning for gold back in the 19th century or something like that. This is gold dust that is sort of in small quantities throughout the soil. And what they do is they grind up the rocks and the dirt, they mix it with water and cyanide, and the cyanide attaches to the gold. It's called cyanide leaching. With that, they're able to sort of extract this gold dust from the rocks and soil. And it takes a ton of earth to produce an ounce of gold with this method. A ton of earth and a lot of water. And in the process, they're using all of the water that the Mayan people depend on. They're pushing Mayan people off their land. They're poisoning the water when they use it. They're poisoning it with cyanide, mercury, arsenic, lead. And they're destroying indigenous communities in the process. And so Rights Action has been fighting against that gold mining, and again working together with Guatemalan human rights groups, with indigenous human rights groups, partnering with them. And so that to me is another, and the gold mining that's happening today in Guatemala, to me, again, it's a sort of neocolonialism that sort of combines white supremacy with colonial power, with military power, economic power, etc. And so the Mayan people today, what they're experiencing today is really just a sort of continuation of the colonialism that they experienced under the conquistadors. At least in my view, it is.
And that makes sense, especially in the way of, in the same connection you made in Hawaii, to where the rainforest is more than just, a carbon reducer and an oxygen producer. It is an ecosystem, it is a home, it is a sacral site, it is indigenous cultural heritage sites that exist within Hawaii, and in the same way that this even maybe wasn't traditionally the indigenous land of the Mayan people in Guatemala, it is now the current home of the indigenous folks there. So even though this in addition of the use of land, the use of water, and the destruction of both, can sort of cross over in that intersection with also a human rights issue, an indigenous rights activist issue, and that that sort of ties in for us this idea of environmental racism that I wanted to talk about next with you. You mentioned Flint, Michigan, and sort of being tied into this as well. Can you talk perhaps a little bit about how you see this concept of environmental racism or intersectionality as a whole playing in with neocolonialism, fitting in with something like Flint, Michigan?
Well, right, in colonialism, right, you had these things like the white man's burden, there's these ideas of essentially white supremacy, but also, as I said, military power, economic power, political power, cultural power, etc., and exploitation of people, exploitation of land, exploitation of environmental resources, and even sort of referring to them as resources, to me, indicates a certain attitude towards the natural environment, right? It's, to think of something as a resource is to think of it as something that's there for you to use.
Yeah.
As opposed to thinking of it as a place with spiritual significance, with cultural significance, with biological significance, right? As opposed to thinking of it as a living place. But anyway, in the case of Flint, Michigan, I mean, we had this disaster with the lead in the city water supply, and as you probably know, that happened after the state of Michigan had essentially removed all power from Flint's city council, right? The state of Michigan had put in place a city planner and given that person the authority to make decisions, right, about the city's budget and other things. That person was appointed by the governor, was not elected by the people of Flint, right? And that person decided to take Flint off of the water, the water supply that they had been using, and instead to take water from the Flint River, without it being properly treated, and that's what ultimately led to the corrosion of the old pipes in Flint, and allowed lead to get into people's water supply. That city planner being appointed by the state government, to me, and this happened in several cities in Michigan, but really it happened only in cities that were majority people of color. And to me, it even sort of reminded me of that old idea of the white man's burden, right? Sort of the sort of idea that white people know what's best for someone else, and that they're going by taking over and sort of putting themselves in charge, that they're actually helping the people. There's this sort of justification. And so, so in Flint, we have a perfect example of environmental racism, right? Where the people whose children were being poisoned by the water were predominantly poor, predominantly people of color, not entirely, many working class white people there as well, but predominantly people of color, predominantly poor. They'd already been disenfranchised by the state, and then they had to sort of suffer this terrible situation where you have to worry about your health, your children's health, particularly. And I remember, I was actually in Detroit a few years ago for an Amnesty International conference, a human rights conference. And I was talking with somebody from Flint. And I don't remember how this came up, but he said that sort of he doesn't really have like the time and energy to worry about something like global warming because he's so focused on making sure that his daughter isn't going to be poisoned by the water in their house.
Yeah.
I understand that. I get that. I mean, if I was living in a place where my water had lead in it and I had young children, that's what I would be worried about. That's what I would be spending my energy on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I get that that's what he has to put his effort into. But I think, I sort of see all of these struggles as connected in certain ways, right? I think that the gold mining in Guatemala, the geothermal power in Hawaii, the tar sands in Alberta, the pipeline to carry oil from those tar sands down to the Gulf of Mexico, the poisoning of the water in Flint, right? All of that to me, it's part of the same struggle, right? It has to do with a kind of neocolonialism, right? It has to do with white supremacy. It has to do with economic interests, right? It has to do with people who have power and privilege using that to benefit themselves economically at the expense of indigenous peoples, First Nations people, at the expense of people of color, so you might have like a middle class white environmental activist from the suburbs who's worried about global warming.
Yeah.
You might have First Nations people in Alberta who are worried about the loss of their land, the loss of their caribou herds, the loss of their water, because the tar sands mining in Alberta is the biggest oil project in the world, and it's the most environmentally damaging oil project in the world. It's destroying the land up there, and First Nations people are suffering from it, right? And then the oil that comes out of there is a very low quality oil. It actually contributes more to global warming than any other oil that we're drilling for anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And then, the pipeline that carried down across the United States, ultimately, it's going to affect, for example, people in Louisiana's Cancer Alley who are exposed to, people of color in Cancer Alley are disproportionately exposed to toxins from the petrochemical industry, right? And that's another example of environmental racism, right? Of how environmental impacts are often tied to racism, where the worst impacts are often sort of intentionally placed in areas where it's poor people and people of color who are going to bear the burdens of those impacts. So for me, the sort of fight against environmental racism in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, the fight against the pipelines, the fight against the Alberta tar sands, they're all connected, and each of us sort of has to play whatever part we can.
Yeah.
If your part is fighting to clean up the water in Flint, Michigan, and that's where your energy is, great, right? If your part is to focus on global warming, if your part is to focus on stopping these pipelines, great, but we also need to be building these coalitions and working together. I think ultimately that is crucial.
Yes. And I thank you for your expansion. I think I did know quite a bit of that information about the Alberta tar sands, and definitely something that I think is very important. I've been introduced through environmental ethics this idea of the systematic versus the personal, and I know with a lot of conversation happening right now on the Black Lives Matter movement, this is a similar discussion about more than just the personal, but in the movement of switching government funds from different organizations. This has to do with the systematic change. Can you speak briefly over how we need to be focusing on systematic change versus a personal change in regards to environmental racism or in regards to environmentalism as a whole?
Yeah, sure, thanks. All right. Let me try and think. I can think of a few examples here, right? So, if we think about the environmental impact of plastics, right? Plastics right now, the petrochemical industry has been pushing single-use plastics because they're made from petrochemicals, and it's one way for them to sell their product. They've been pushing single-use plastics, and what we've seen is an explosion in the use of single-use plastics in the United States and around the world. So when you go into a supermarket, for example, if you look around, almost everything is wrapped in plastic, right? So your tomatoes come in a plastic container, your yogurt comes in a plastic container, your lettuce comes in a plastic container, on and on and on and on and on, right? When we think about the problem of, it is producing a mountain of plastic waste, that plastic waste is building up in our oceans, it's building up in third world countries, in Africa, in Asia, where those plastics are being shipped to supposedly be recycled. But in the truth of the matter, in many cases, only a small portion of the plastic can really be recycled. A lot of it is not terribly useful or economically viable to recycle it. It winds up impacting the natural environment in the ocean. It winds up impacting the organisms that live in the ocean. But it winds up impacting people, right? Predominantly people of color in countries where these wastes are being shipped. And the petrochemical industry, their sort of answer to the problem of plastic waste is, well, we can solve that problem if everybody will just recycle their plastic, right? So they keep pushing recycling as this way of addressing the problem. And that puts the burden, on the individual, right? Like it's your job to, when you finish using your yogurt, to put it in your recycling bin and try and send it off to a recycling center, right? And if you just do that, then the problem will be solved. Several problems with that, right? One, sort of by focusing on recycling, it really sort of takes the focus off more systemic issues, right? What is the petrochemical industry doing?
Yeah.
Right? It takes focus off questions like, should we really be wrapping everything in plastic to begin with? And so instead, it sort of puts the burden on individual consumers. It says, you do your part and everything will be fine. Right? But because of the systems that are in place, there's really, you as an individual cannot make much of an impact on this. You as an individual, when you walk into the supermarket, good luck trying to buy things that don't come wrapped in plastic. You have to work really, really hard to do that, right? If you go to a farmer's market, you might be able to find some tomatoes that are not wrapped in plastic, right? Or some lettuce that's not wrapped in plastic. If you have the time and the access to go to a farmer's market and do that, you might be able to do that. But for most people, if you go to a supermarket, good luck finding things that are not wrapped in plastic. Yeah. And once you bring those things home, even if you do put them in a recycling bin, the truth of the matter is that something like 90% of them are not going to end up actually being recycled. 90% of those plastics are not, it's not economically viable to recycle. It's too complicated, and they're going to wind up being shipped to other countries. Or they're going to be burned, and they're going to wind up poisoning people in Indonesia, in China, in Nigeria. And that again is a form of environmental racism, right? So by trying to put the burden on the individual to make that change, they're really sort of avoiding addressing the systemic problems that we really need to deal with. And when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, right, that's part of the point that this movement has been making as well, right? That we can't sort of solve the problems of police violence by just sort of saying, well, by either putting the burden on training police officers, right? If we just train the police officers to de-escalate, no. Training police officers to de-escalate is a perfectly good thing to do, but that's not going to solve the problem of police violence, right? And so whether, it's everything from the systems that are in place to protect police who committed violence, So that when a police officer kills an unarmed black man, for example, what we've seen over and over again is that they learn what to say. They learn, how to say, I feared for my life. And then there's a system in place to essentially make sure that person, that police officer is probably not going to be prosecuted. If they are prosecuted, they're probably not going to be convicted. And then they also receive support from the police unions. They also tend to be on good relationships with the prosecutors. So you've got this whole systemic framework in place. And we can't tear down that framework by working on an individual level, right? It requires working together to tear down the systemic problem. So the sort of the systemic issue that we see with environmental racism is very, is closely tied to the systemic issue we see with police violence.
Mm. And thank you for that explanation. I feel like it is a good representation of the larger philosophical ideas of how we can interact in a different way, because it doesn't necessarily remove the pressure from individuals to act. Changing that direction in which to act, or looking for larger systems of change, looking to implore our politicians to make a different change within our society, instead of putting the pressure to recycle, for example. And so I think that was a very good explanation. I think one of the things that I would like to finish up with is to give you a space to speak about what you would like to. That's something that I've always offered within Bridgecast that I think is important. So is there anything that you'd like to share to the Bridge Builders community now? Anything?
Well, sure. Thank you. I want to go back to this idea of colonialism and neocolonialism and decolonization. Yeah. Because I do think that sort of some of the systems of thought and justification that were put in place to justify colonialism, they're still being played out in the world today, and they're still impacting us in negative ways. When I think of colonization or neocolonialism, I think one of the clearest examples of neocolonialism I've seen in my lifetime was the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. Because in 2003, the U.S. military invaded Iraq, occupied the country, removed the government of Saddam Hussein, and look, Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator. But the U.S. removed Saddam Hussein and put in place a government that would be friendly to the United States. And we took control of the oil fields that they had in Iraq as well, right? So in the process of doing all this, we justified it by saying that we were liberating the people of Iraq, right, from a dictator, from Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein was a dictator, but the idea that we're sort of doing this for the benefit of the Iraqi people, to me, again, it really reminded me of that old white man's burden, right? That the colonizers are here to help the people who are being colonized, right? Which is an incredible. It takes a certain amount of gall to sort of even claim that, I think. But that's what we said in Iraq, is that we're liberating the people of Iraq. And in the process, we're ensuring our free access to oil supplies and things like that. And that, to me, is just neocolonialism, pure and simple, right? It's a combination of military might, economic and political power for the benefit of the colonizer, ultimately, while justifying it by claiming that it's being done for the benefit of those who are colonized. So what we saw in Iraq, to me, I feel like we see these patterns repeated over and over again. So to me, there's a close connection between that sort of neocolonialism by the U.S. military in Iraq, the neocolonialism we've seen by the U.S. military in places like Nicaragua, Guatemala, etc. the continuing impacts of colonialism in Hawaii, in Alberta, at Standing Rock, etc., etc. So, I haven't seen the podcast you did last week, but I'll be excited to go back and take a look at it. And sort of, I hope that there'll be some themes there that will connect to some of the things that we're talking about here today.
There are most definitely some themes and patterns, and I think that one of the things that Kieran mentioned last week that specifically sticks with me is the amount of indigenous activist support for the Black Lives Matter movement in this way. And I think that what we talked about today really expanded upon Kieran's claim to show the reasons for it to be a reality. One of the things that I have seen as a pattern within your conversations is what I've experienced with the Lakota people working with bridge builders. The Native American population that exists within Dupree, the stories that's being shared both from the boarding schools in the 1980s all the way down to events like Wounded Knee. And in the very placement of the reservations is in a place that is not exactly preferred by the indigenous people who were there in the first place, and that the agreement set upon was not on particular sacred sites, or not in fertile land or preferred land, and we see it playing out to this day. We see it playing out in the existing community of the Lakota people in South Dakota and North Dakota to this very day. So I see there being a lot of patterns and a lot of interesting things for us to ponder as a community. I really appreciate you coming and speaking with us, Dr. Moriarty. I think that you articulate very well and have this very expansive view on the larger picture and the connections of how both we can connect Rainforest and Hawaii with Flint, Michigan, to the work of human rights organizations in Guatemala. So again, I thank you, and I look forward to continuing working with you, Dr. Moriarty, with Bridge Builders.
Thank you, my pleasure, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and we will see you next week. Bye.